November 24, 1950. General Peng Dehuai stands in his command post in the frozen mountains of North Korea, watching reports flow in from Chinese scouts positioned along MacArthur's advancing columns. American forces are scattered, overextended, racing north toward the Yalu River with almost no defensive preparation. MacArthur is so confident that Chinese intervention is not coming that he has split his army into separated units that cannot support each other. What Peng says to his commanders in this moment reveals a military mind that has been waiting patiently for exactly this configuration. The trap has been set for weeks. 300,000 Chinese soldiers are hidden in positions MacArthur's intelligence has completely failed to detect. And now MacArthur has walked his army directly into the killing zone. Peng's words are not celebration or excitement. They are cold professional assessment that the enemy has made every mistake necessary for complete tactical success. Tomorrow the attack begins. Subscribe for more MacArthur stories and help us reach 500 subscribers. Peng Dehuai is not the Chinese leader Americans know. That is Mao Zedong, the revolutionary chairman who makes political decisions about intervention. Peng is the military professional, the general who will actually command Chinese forces in Korea, and who must figure out how to fight the world's most powerful military, with soldiers who lack air power, have primitive logistics, and carry equipment that is generations behind American technology. When Mao chooses Peng to command the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in Korea, he is choosing someone who understands how to fight asymmetric warfare, someone who has spent decades defeating better-equipped enemies through superior tactics and willingness to accept casualties that wealthier armies cannot imagine enduring. What Peng says when he accepts the command reveals his clear-eyed assessment of the challenge. He tells Mao that Chinese forces cannot defeat American forces in conventional warfare. American air power will devastate Chinese troop concentrations if they mass in ways that American doctrine expects. American artillery and firepower will inflict horrific casualties in any direct assault. American logistics and mobility will allow them to respond quickly to Chinese moves if those moves are predictable. Peng understands all of these disadvantages and accepts them as parameters within which he must operate, rather than as reasons intervention cannot succeed. His task is not to defeat American military power through superior force, but to defeat American strategy through better understanding of the terrain, the weather, and MacArthur's psychology. The strategy Peng develops for Chinese intervention is based on exploiting every weakness he can identify in how MacArthur is fighting the war. MacArthur relies on aerial reconnaissance for intelligence about enemy positions, so Chinese forces will move only at night when American aircraft cannot see them. MacArthur expects enemies to mass for attacks, so Chinese forces will infiltrate in small groups and concentrate only at the moment of attack. MacArthur's doctrine emphasizes firepower delivered from distance, so Chinese forces will get close to American positions before attacking, negating American artillery and air support advantages. MacArthur is confident that Chinese intervention is not occurring on large scale, so Peng will use that confidence to achieve complete surprise about the size and capability of forces being committed. What distinguishes Peng's approach from conventional military thinking is his willingness to accept casualties and hardships that American military doctrine would consider unacceptable. Chinese soldiers will carry minimal supplies and will plan to capture American equipment and food. They will endure cold that American forces consider unbearable. They will accept casualty rates that would cause American units to be pulled from front lines. This is not recklessness, but calculated asymmetry. Peng understands that Chinese soldiers' willingness to endure what American soldiers will not endure creates tactical advantages that compensate for material disadvantages. The question is whether these advantages can be exploited before Chinese forces are destroyed by American firepower. The infiltration of Chinese forces into North Korea during October and November 1950 is executed according to Peng's careful planning. Units cross the Yalu River at night, moving in dispersed formations that avoid detection by American reconnaissance. They hide in villages, caves, and tunnels during daylight, maintaining strict discipline to prevent accidental disclosure of their positions. They establish supply caches using captured North Korean equipment and facilities. By mid-November, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers are positioned throughout North Korea, ready to attack when Peng gives the order. MacArthur's intelligence, relying on aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, detects almost nothing of this massive operation. Peng has achieved strategic surprise not through deception about Chinese intentions, which have been clearly stated in warnings, but through tactical concealment that makes MacArthur's headquarters believe Chinese forces are not present in significant numbers, even though they are positioned to attack. Peng Dehuai does not need to create the conditions for Chinese tactical success. MacArthur creates them through decisions driven by overconfidence and by dismissal of intelligence that contradicts his assumptions. Every report Peng receives from his scouts and from his forward units confirms that American forces are advancing in ways that make them vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack Peng is planning. MacArthur is not making subtle errors that only become apparent in hindsight. He is making obvious mistakes that any competent military professional can recognize as dangerous. Peng watches these mistakes accumulate with grim satisfaction, knowing that each error makes Chinese attack more likely to succeed. What Peng says to his commanders about MacArthur's dispositions reveals professional assessment of enemy who is defeating himself through carelessness. MacArthur has split his forces into separated columns advancing on different axes toward the Yalu River. These columns are too far apart to provide mutual support if attacked. MacArthur has prioritized speed over security, racing north to claim victory rather than establishing solid defensive positions that would allow coordinated response to attack. MacArthur has stretched his supply lines thin, making American forces dependent on roads that can be easily cut by Chinese infiltration. Every one of these decisions makes sense if Chinese intervention is not occurring, but they are catastrophic if Chinese forces are present in large numbers positioned to attack. Peng does not need to outthink MacArthur. He simply needs to punish the mistakes MacArthur is making through overconfidence. The reports Peng receives from his intelligence officers confirm that MacArthur's headquarters is not taking Chinese intervention seriously, despite growing evidence. American units are encountering Chinese soldiers and reporting this to headquarters. But MacArthur's intelligence staff is explaining these encounters as evidence of small volunteer units rather than as indications of major Chinese military operation. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable. Evidence that contradicts MacArthur's assessment that Chinese intervention is not occurring is being reinterpreted to fit that assessment rather than being taken as warning that the assessment might be wrong. Peng understands that this is exactly the kind of intelligence failure that creates opportunities for devastating surprise attacks. What makes MacArthur's mistakes particularly exploitable from Peng's perspective is that they are driven by psychological factors rather than by military necessity. MacArthur wants to win the war quickly and dramatically. He wants to prove that his strategy of advancing to the Yalu River is correct, despite warnings from Washington and despite Chinese diplomatic threats. He wants to deliver the victory he has promised before Christmas. All of these desires create pressure to advance quickly and to dismiss evidence that might require a more cautious approach. Peng recognizes that MacArthur is not making cold, rational calculations about risk and reward. He is making decisions driven by need to vindicate his strategic vision and to prove his critics wrong. This psychological vulnerability is as important as the tactical vulnerabilities in MacArthur's dispositions. The decision about when to launch the Chinese attack is determined partly by military considerations about optimal conditions, but also by assessment of when MacArthur is most committed and most vulnerable. Peng wants MacArthur to be deep into North Korea, far from the 38th parallel, where retreat would be easier. He wants American forces to be maximally extended with supply lines stretched thin. He wants MacArthur to be completely convinced that Chinese intervention is not occurring so that the shock of massive attack will be psychologically devastating as well as tactically effective. By late November, all of these conditions are met. MacArthur has committed his forces to advance that has placed them exactly where Peng wants them. What Peng says when he orders the attack on November 25th is that the enemy has cooperated perfectly in creating conditions for his own defeat. Now Chinese forces must execute the plan that American mistakes have made possible. The Chinese attack that begins on November 25, 1950, is executed according to plan that Peng has refined through weeks of preparation and through careful study of American tactics and vulnerabilities. Chinese forces attack at night, using darkness to negate American air power advantage. They infiltrate close to American positions before attacking, getting inside American defensive perimeters before firepower can be brought to bear effectively. They strike simultaneously across entire front, preventing American forces from reinforcing positions under attack. They cut roads and surround American units, creating psychological pressure as well as tactical threat. Every aspect of the attack is designed to exploit American vulnerabilities while minimizing Chinese exposure to American strengths. What Peng says to his commanders during the initial attacks reveals his focus on creating shock and confusion that will prevent effective American response. The goal is not just to inflict casualties, but to destroy American confidence and to create sense that the situation is out of control. Chinese forces are instructed to create noise and chaos that will make American forces feel surrounded by overwhelming numbers, even when Chinese local superiority is not as great as it appears. The psychological dimension of the attack, the sense that Chinese forces are everywhere and that the situation is hopeless, matters as much as the tactical victories. Peng understands that breaking American will to fight is as important as destroying American military units. The immediate tactical results of the Chinese attack exceed even Peng's expectations. American forces, caught completely by surprise, suffer catastrophic defeats across multiple fronts. Units that thought they faced minimal resistance find themselves surrounded by Chinese forces attacking from multiple directions. The reports flooding into MacArthur's headquarters describe disaster unfolding faster than anyone can process. Peng receives these reports through Chinese intelligence and through monitoring American radio communications. And what he says to his staff is that MacArthur's overconfidence has created exactly the kind of tactical collapse that careful preparation was designed to produce. The battle at Chosin Reservoir becomes the symbol of Chinese tactical success and American resilience. American Marines find themselves surrounded by Chinese forces in frozen mountains, fighting in conditions that test human endurance. The fighting is brutal, and casualties are heavy on both sides. The Marines fight their way back toward the coast rather than surrendering, creating what becomes longest fighting retreat in American military history. From Peng's perspective, the battle demonstrates both the success of Chinese tactics in creating impossible situation for American forces and the limits of what Chinese forces can achieve. American units, even when surrounded and outnumbered, fight with discipline and determination that makes their complete destruction difficult, even when tactical circumstances favor Chinese forces. What makes Peng's offensive historically significant is not just the tactical victories but the strategic impact of demonstrating that American military power has limits. Chinese forces have proven that technological superiority does not guarantee victory when enemy uses tactics that negate technological advantages and when enemy is willing to accept casualties that Americans will not accept. The psychological impact throughout Asia and throughout the world is profound. The military that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan has been fought to standstill by Chinese forces that lack air power, have primitive logistics, and operate with equipment that is generations behind American technology. Peng's tactical success validates Mao's strategic calculation that intervention was necessary and feasible, and it establishes China as military power that must be respected rather than dismissed as weak nation that would not dare confront American forces. The success of Peng Dehuai's offensive against MacArthur's forces comes at terrible human cost that Peng accepts as necessary price for achieving Chinese strategic objectives. Chinese casualties during the offensive and the subsequent months of fighting number in hundreds of thousands. Soldiers freeze to death in attack positions. Chinese forces suffer horrific losses from American artillery and air power. The logistics of supplying Chinese forces deep in Korean territory prove even more difficult than Peng anticipated, leading to situations where Chinese soldiers are starving and lack ammunition. The willingness to accept these costs distinguishes Chinese military culture from American military culture and explains how Chinese forces can achieve tactical success despite material disadvantages. What Peng says about Chinese casualties reveals his understanding that revolutionary warfare requires different calculus about acceptable losses than conventional military doctrine teaches. He tells his commanders that Chinese soldiers are fighting for their homeland security and for the revolution that liberated China from decades of foreign domination and civil war. This ideological commitment, combined with Chinese soldiers' endurance and discipline, allows them to continue fighting in conditions that would cause other armies to collapse. Peng does not minimize the suffering his soldiers endure. He visits front lines constantly and sees the frozen bodies, the wounded without adequate medical care, the soldiers fighting with minimal supplies, but he believes these sacrifices serve essential Chinese security interests that justify the costs. The limitations of what Chinese forces can achieve despite their tactical successes become clear as the offensive continues into December. Chinese forces push American troops back from the Yalu River and create military crisis for MacArthur's command. But Chinese casualties and logistical problems prevent Peng from pursuing retreating American forces aggressively enough to destroy them completely. American forces, despite the shock of surprise and the tactical defeats, maintain enough cohesion to conduct fighting retreat rather than collapsing into rout. The initial Chinese tactical success is dramatic, but Chinese forces cannot convert tactical victory into strategic annihilation of American forces that Peng might have hoped for. What Peng recognizes by December is that the war will not end with decisive Chinese victory, any more than it ended with decisive American victory after Incheon. Chinese intervention has prevented American conquest of North Korea and has demonstrated that Chinese security interests cannot be ignored. But Chinese forces cannot drive American forces off Korean peninsula entirely without suffering casualties that even Chinese tolerance for losses cannot sustain. The war is settling into stalemate where neither side can achieve decisive victory, which from Chinese strategic perspective is acceptable outcome. Chinese core objective was preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea, not conquering South Korea, and that limited objective has been achieved despite terrible costs. The relationship between Peng and his political leadership in Beijing becomes complicated by the human costs of the intervention. Mao and other Chinese leaders, distant from the battlefield, sometimes pressure Peng to pursue more aggressive operations that Peng believes would waste lives without achieving strategic gains. Peng must balance political pressure for continued offensive action against military realities that make such action increasingly costly and less likely to succeed. What Peng says in communications with Beijing reveals frustration with political leaders who do not fully grasp the tactical realities Peng faces daily. This tension between political objectives and military feasibility is characteristic of revolutionary warfare and contributes to the eventual stalemate that ends the war, rather than to decisive victory by either side. What Peng Dehuai said when MacArthur walked into China's trap was vindicated by the tactical success of Chinese intervention and by achievement of Chinese core strategic objective of preventing American forces from occupying all of Korea. The trap Peng set, exploiting MacArthur's overconfidence and his intelligence failures, worked exactly as planned. American forces were caught by surprise, suffered significant defeats, and were pushed back from Chinese border. This success validated Mao's decision to intervene and established Peng as capable military commander who understood how to fight asymmetric warfare against technologically superior enemy. But Peng's personal fate demonstrates the tragedy that often follows military success in totalitarian systems, where political loyalty matters more than professional competence. The immediate aftermath of Peng's success in Korea brought him recognition as military hero who defended Chinese security interests against American aggression. When the war ended in armistice in 1953, Chinese propaganda portrayed the intervention as great victory that proved Chinese military prowess, and that established China as power that could stand up to American imperialism. Peng was celebrated as commander who engineered this success through tactical brilliance and through willingness to accept costs that victory required. His reputation in China reached heights that few military commanders in any country achieve. But Peng's tragedy began when he dared to criticize Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward policy in 1959. Peng, who had been willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers to achieve strategic objectives in Korea, could not remain silent when Mao's economic policies were causing mass starvation that killed millions of Chinese civilians. At a 1959 party meeting, Peng wrote a letter to Mao criticizing the Great Leap Forward and calling for more realistic economic policies. Mao viewed this criticism as betrayal and launched a campaign against Peng that destroyed his career and led to his imprisonment and torture during the Cultural Revolution. The general who had defeated MacArthur's forces died in prison in 1974, a victim of the political system he had served with such dedication and success. The historical vindication of Peng's military strategy comes from recognition that his approach to fighting the Korean War was more realistic and more effective than strategies that relied purely on material superiority. Peng understood that technological advantages can be negated by tactical innovation, that psychological factors matter as much as material factors in warfare, and that accepting costs that enemy will not accept creates asymmetric advantages. These insights remain relevant to understanding contemporary asymmetric conflicts, where materially weaker forces compete successfully against technologically superior adversaries. The trap Peng set for MacArthur demonstrated principles that continue to shape how revolutionary and insurgent forces fight conventionally superior enemies. The final assessment of what Peng said when MacArthur walked into China's trap is that Peng correctly identified how overconfidence and intelligence failure create opportunities for weaker forces to defeat stronger enemies. MacArthur's certainty that Chinese intervention was not occurring made him vulnerable to surprise attack. His dismissal of evidence that contradicted his assumptions created exactly the conditions Peng needed for tactical success. The trap was not clever deception that fooled sophisticated intelligence apparatus. It was careful preparation that exploited enemies' willful blindness to evidence that was available, but that was being ignored because it contradicted comfortable assumptions. Peng's legacy is demonstrating that sometimes the best strategy for defeating superior enemy is simply to wait for that enemy to defeat himself through mistakes driven by overconfidence, and then to exploit those mistakes through disciplined execution of well-prepared plan. MacArthur walked into the trap because he could not imagine that his strategic vision might be wrong. Peng's vindication came from recognizing this psychological vulnerability and from having the patience to wait for MacArthur to create the conditions for his own defeat. Subscribe to see more stories about how MacArthur's strategic decisions created opportunities his enemies exploited.